Good morning. Well, in the interest of time after yesterday's experience, I'd like to keep it brief. Our panel this morning is on. Is Marty here? No, not yet. We can talk about him then. This morning's panel is on Amartya Sen's challenge to what he calls the narrowing of mainstream economics, and we might actually expand that to include the social sciences more generally, to a homo economicus understanding of human behavior, conveyed perhaps in its most robust simplicity in Gary Becker's classic and much cited work, Economic Approaches to Human Behavior of 1976, where he argued, this is a quote, all human behavior can be viewed as involving participants who, 1, maximize their utility, 2, form a stable set of preferences, and 3, accumulate an optimal amount of information and other inputs in a variety of markets. Now, one of Sen's major contributions to the social sciences, of course, has been to demonstrate the poverty of this approach. Of course, he's not alone. The field itself has self-examined and admitted a richer complex of human motivation, which makes me wonder why then it is still self-styled as rational choice. But in any case, Sen illustrates the poverty of all of this by returning us to our roots, by referring us back to the proverbial father of economics, Adam Smith, father of modern capitalist economics, Adam Smith, who it turns out had an amazing grasp of the complexity of human motivation, emotion, cognition, social learning networks. That was all lost to a great extent on his disciples in economics today. And this was long before, he saw these things long before we had the technologies to actually study them. Nick Phillipson, in his new biography of Adam Smith, remarked that few people have been as unlucky in their disciples as Adam Smith. And that's probably right. Amartya is probably a truer student of Smith, and listen to what he says. Listen to what he says here. He said, Smith is often wrongly thought to be a proponent of the assumption of the exclusive pursuit of self-interest in the form of the so-called economic man. In fact, Smith discussed fairly elaborately the limitations of the assumption of a universal pursuit of self-interest. He pointed to the fact that self-love, as he called the underlying impulse behind narrowly self-interested behavior, might be just one of many motivations that human beings have. And he talks about how the interpretation of Adam Smith has been a veritable battleground, and it has. And he cites a limerick, an early 20th century limerick by a fellow by the name of Stephen Laycock, which kind of captures this view of Smith and everything that was said to have followed from him. And the poem says, or the limerick goes, Adam, Adam, Adam Smith, listen what I charge you with. Didn't you say in class one day that selfishness was bound to pay? Of all doctrines, that was the pith. Wasn't it, wasn't it, wasn't it, Smith? Well, so Smith plays a central role in this new book, The Idea of Justice, and starts the discussion. And we're delighted this morning to have a diverse and exciting set of participants who think about the question of human behavior and social coordination from a variety of backgrounds and disciplines. So on the panel this morning, we have Francesca Moneti, Senior Child Protection Specialist at UNICEF, James Fowler, my colleague in the Department of Political Science, professor in the School of Medicine and in the Division of Social Sciences here at UCSD. James Konow, professor of economics at Loyola Marymount. Walter Sinnott-Armstrong, Chauncey Stillman professor in practical ethics in the Department of Philosophy and the Kenan Institute for Ethics at Duke University, and also co-director of the MacArthur Law and Neuroscience Project. And our discussants are my colleague Marcel Henaff, philosopher and anthropologist who has appointments in the departments of literature and political science, and my colleague Darren Schreiber, assistant professor of political science. So we'll begin with Francesca.
Good morning, everyone. Of course, I need to start by thanking Jerry in particular, and Fonna even more in particularly, for having organized all of this. But I also, besides the typical thanks, I need to also thank the European Commission, strangely enough, because it's thanks to them that we got a significant multi-year grant, which allowed UNICEF not only to support work in countries, but also to do some knowledge development and application, and further knowledge development, which is really what I'm here to share my excitement about with all of you. But a third thanks is to all of you, because even just in this last couple of days, I've been learning an awful lot, and I don't have time to do the kind of academic reading that you all have the pleasure to do, I think, which we envy you for, but you envy us for being able to apply it. So here is the bridge that Jerry and I have been trying to build over the last 7 years. But we're still real young, so we've got a lot more time to do more. Basically, what I'd like to do in the 10 minutes that I have, because I have a video I want to show you, is take you through this very quickly through the journey that we've been on, which began in 2004 with the joint exploration of how to bring an end to female genital mutilation and cutting, which, as some of you may know, affects some 3 million girls every year. Just on the African continent, and of course more because there's migration, but we don't have those numbers. And in looking at female genital mutilation cutting, Jerry helped us to understand and view the theory that's behind that explains the practice and its perpetuation. And in particular, he helped us to focus on the social interactions, the social dynamics which perpetuate the practice, or when abandonment starts to begin, accelerate and motivate the abandonment. And many of us in UNICEF sort of felt in our gut some of the things that were right, and we were kind of doing them. But it was, as Amartya said yesterday, more kind of ad hoc. And the theory helped us to bring a lot of the pieces together and see the overall logic. Conversely, I think that we can take credit for having enabled Jerry and others through the application of the thinking to realities, different realities in different countries, to further refine and progress on the theoretical thinking. And this is exactly why I'm so excited about the center that you've inaugurated just now, because we need more of that. We need more of the bringing the theory and the practice together. And in our case, we're really happy because it makes a difference to the lives of children, and that's what UNICEF is all about. So rather than speaking a lot, I'm going to, I think, maybe show the video first, and then I'd like to highlight a few things. Now, the preferred video that I had is only online, and I don't have the downloaded version. So I am showing you the second preferred video. We have, with the European Union, as part of the dissemination of our work and trying to spread it, we've produced one video on the website, which, if you'd like to take it down, is just unicef.org/EC. There's an area with on changing harmful practices, and there's a video called "Protecting Child's Rights," which looks at across countries, and then we have specific videos on Sudan, Senegal, and Ethiopia that look at different. They're similar in some ways, but some look more at communities, some look more at the national dimensions. And the one I'm showing you, the one in Sudan, is the work in Sudan is national level work, whereas the change in terms of abandonment of female genital cutting and child marriage ultimately is local. And ultimately, as we found through the application of social convention theory and game theory, it's about, it's collective. It can't happen by any individual. It needs to happen, I mean, it's rare for it to happen by any individual, but it requires a collective approach. So ultimately, the change happens locally, but the campaign, the work is happening nationally. And what's, for us, really important in how it relates in many ways to the book that Amartya Sen has written and to Fonna's introductory remarks, is that it's not just, by looking just at the economic angle, which is the one that dominates development thinking, development work, we could never have gotten here. We had to look at the social angle. We had to look at the social interactions. And what we need more of, with all of your help, is to further develop the understanding of the social interactions and its intersections with legals and others. But so this is this is the focus.
An ordinary day in northern Sudan. Tahani Omar Ali and her daughters are taking care of household chores. Tahani's expression is serene, but it belies a life marked by pain.
I remember the day of my circumcision very well indeed. I was 5 years old and it was a painful day. I stayed in bed for 15 days, after which it healed, but for the rest of my life I suffered. I suffer in my daily life.
Female genital cutting is widespread in this sparsely populated and conservative region. The roots of the practice are tangled deep in Sudan's social and religious traditions and wrapped in the concepts of female honour. The word to describe an uncut girl is a word of shame. But UNICEF and the European Commission are working with the Sudanese to develop a new way of thinking about girls who have not been cut. The program is based on one very carefully chosen word, Salima.
Salima in itself is an Arabic word which means complete, intact, whole, as God created.
The Salima campaign encourages conversation about human rights between families, neighbours and communities. The conversation often begins in a non-formal classroom where women and girls meet regularly to discuss their health.
I convince them by approaching them little by little, not abruptly. I use proper logic, gaining their friendship. I use booklets and posters and seminars too.
In a country as large as Sudan, mass media is essential to broadcast the positive message of Salima. But if the materials are modern, their dissemination is age-old, using community forums and theatre, song and dance. In this way, the message is transmitted from community to community. Wearing a traditional scarf in the Salima colours can start a conversation. The scarves for men and women have been distributed in more than 15 states, and more than 200 communities have adopted the campaign.
We designed these colors as Salima slogans, and these colors means that everybody who wears this, that means he is Salima, and he is supporting abandoning FGM. This will lead to what? To a very wide dialogue in the community.
Also joining the dialogue are more than 100 religious leaders.
There is a growing human rights movement in the country. There are many conservative and reactionary who try to speak about human rights as a cultural imperialism from outside. We have done exactly the opposite, to say that Islam is the greatest bastion supporter of human rights.
European Commission support helps to get Salima to the widest possible audience.
The European Commission is one of the direct donors and major donors of this project, and with support to UNICEF, UNICEF has managed to scale up the project on abandoning FGM during the last 2 years.
That support leads to ceremonies where communities publicly celebrate their decision to stop cutting and declare that it's in everybody's best interests.
The campaign is targeting the communities. The abandoning of FGM should not be as a personal act. It should be as the act for the whole community.
Salima has encouraged couples like Tahani Omar Ali and her husband to jointly decide what is best for their daughters.
When I came across this program, Salima, I consulted my wife. We were ready and prepared to respond to this program. A girl is born Salima, so leave her Salima.
In reaching this decision, Tahani and Abdul have not only given their children lives free from the debilitating medical and psychological consequences of genital cutting, they've opened the door to a more prosperous future in which all of Sudan's daughters can reach their full human potential.
I hope that gives you a sense of the importance of the social interactions. As you saw, the Salima, oh, is Aziz here today? Where's Aziz? He's not here. I wanted to, oh, here he is. I wanted to make one comment that I think you'll enjoy. As we went on with our work on bringing out the positive values, linking them with human rights. Oh, sorry. Thank you. This was really the whole effort, which I'm not sure comes across fully in the video, but if we started to just look at FGC by itself, it didn't work. Why? Because this is the tradition, it's the culture, it's what people have done for thousands of years and never questioned. And it's linked to Islam, not because it's officially linked to Islam, but because it's associated with a religion. So if instead of beginning the discussion on the practice, the discussion begins with the underlying motive of the practice, which is doing the best for your girls. And by starting it in that way, you cast it in a very different line. And you can link it to all sorts of other aspirations and values, which is the topic of our panel, right? And it's extremely motivating, and it's extremely positive. And at that point, you can begin, or people do begin, especially if, if new information is brought from trusted sources about health, reproductive health, education, and so on, people do begin to question their practices and do begin to see that although by themselves they might not be able to affect change, if they all come together, they absolutely can. Now I come to the point. In the beginning, we were thinking that, well, because of the association with Islam, we needed to de-link FGMC from Islam. Now listen to the negative of all that. De-link, negative, FGMC, a negatively viewed practice, from Islam. And one day, our program officer, who's brilliant, you saw her, Samira, she said, we shouldn't do this anymore. We have to do it differently. And now it'll sound obvious. We want to link Salima, the beautiful, well-developed girl as God made her, to Islam. And it works. I mean, it's the same thing in a way, but it's totally different in another way. And it works. The religious leaders are on board because this completely conforms and is part of what they do. The development of their constituency, if you will, of their communities. So I only have 2 minutes left, so I only want to make one more point, which is that it's the fundamental values that are discussed, and of course this is, you see why we're fascinated and with the whole issue of the discourse and the public discourse. But if that's done by bringing out the fundamental values and linking them to human rights, rather than the other way around, trying to bring human rights and somehow shove them down people's throats, or saying, the Convention on the Rights of the Child is what you should be doing. Well, that doesn't work so well. But if the discussion starts from people's fundamental positive values, which are consistent with human rights, at that point, bringing in human rights actually creates a complex, that brings in a complexity which allows for the development of a discussion along many, many different lines. It allows for the development of a profound discussion that's already structured, if you will, by a tremendous amount of thinking that has gone in by many, many people in many, many different traditions into human rights. But it comes in through the vernacular. It's not the other way around. And I think that's one of the things we need to work on a lot more, is to not come in with the solution, but come in, as Eleanor and I were talking yesterday, in focusing more on the process of what is it that leads people to find their solutions. And we don't have them. We'll never have all the variables to all the solutions, all the determinants, or for most complex things anyway, which human reality is. And so we need to focus much more on the social interactions, the social dynamics, creating the environment, facilitating the public discourse so that the solutions can come. And I'll end there. Thank you. Oh, and if anybody wants, I brought a few copies of the study that we did together with Jerry to look at, and then it's all downloadable from the web. Thank you.
So I wanted to talk to you guys a little bit today about networks. I study networks with Nicholas Christakis, and we've written a book on networks. And we were actually very influenced by the work of people like Amartya Sen and Eleanor Ostrom, because we agree that we need to take not just small steps away from the Homo economicus model, actually giant leaps away from the Homo economicus model. And in fact, what I hope to convince you today is that a more appropriate way of seeing the world, especially when we're thinking about issues of ethics, is that we are not just not economic people, we are network people. We are homo dictius. Dictius is the Greek word for network. And networks have a tremendous impact on a lot of the things that Amartya Sen has written about in his book. And so in particular, I want to talk to you about three components of his theory. One is well-being. It's important for us to understand what well-being is if we're going to have a theory of justice. I also want to talk to you a little bit about decision-making about specific ethical problems and how those spread in networks. And then I want to point out some dilemmas that we wouldn't even be aware of if we weren't thinking of ourselves as being fundamentally connected to one another. So first of all, well-being. One of the really nice passages in Sen's book is this passage about whether or not it makes sense to help men or women in the course of medical treatment, because women tend to live longer, and if you're going to have an egalitarian society, one implication is, well, we should give more medicine to men, which is not exactly an argument that everyone would agree with, right? And so there's something wrong there. But in order to be able to figure out whether or not you're actually helping someone, you need to know, first of all, whether or not someone is well off, and also you need to know whether or not you can trust them to know whether or not they're well off. Because a lot of times you find people that are in situations that are completely unjust, and yet they will tell you that no, everything is fine. We've actually looked at subjective well-being in the Premium Heart Study. It's this lovely study that has been going on since 1948, and we've followed about 5,000 people over 32 years. And in this study, they asked people some questions about their subjective sense of well-being, about their happiness. And just to give you an idea of what a map like this is, each circle represents a person, each line represents a relationship. Some are family relationships and some are non-family relationships. And the circles that are people who say they're happy are yellow, and the people who say that they're sad are blue. And one of the things we find consistently here and in a number of other of our studies is that we have this 3 degrees rule. Your well-being is not just a function of your own choices. It's a function of the state of the other people who surround you. If someone who's directly connected to you claims that they're happy, it increases the likelihood that you'll claim that you're happy by 15%. But it doesn't end there. It actually extends up to 3 degrees of separation. So that if your friend's friend is happy, it increases the likelihood that you'll say you're happy by 10%. And if your friend's friend's friend is happy, it increases the likelihood that you'll say that you're happy by 5%. And so it's not just these direct connections, which Amartya Sen refers to briefly in his book, that could be potentially important for determining behavior. It's even these people that we can't see that potentially have an influence on choices that we make and the consequences of those choices. Now, this is subjective well-being, and it's in real-world social networks. But when I say I study social networks, I also get people asking me, well, aren't you interested in Facebook? Well, yes, we're interested in Facebook. But the problem with Facebook is that Facebook is full of people who are not closely connected to one another. And so a lot of people that you're connected to on Facebook don't have much influence on you. When we look at networks that are actually composed of people who upload and tag pictures of one another, in other words, people who are likely to have a real-world relationship, we find similar patterns. And so here the yellow nodes are people who are smiling in the profile picture or not smiling in the profile picture. And what are the greens? The greens are in between. So that's Nicholas right there. I always have to poke fun of him. So there's evidence that the subjective well-being and that the way we present ourselves to the world in terms of subjective well-being is actually normed not just to the people around us, but to the people around them and the people around them as well. Now, there are objective measures that we've also looked at that have an influence on well-being besides people's self-rating of happiness. And so, for example, we looked at a number of health outcomes. The one that got the most attention was this paper on obesity. And here what we did is we colored each of the nodes yellow for people who are obese and the nodes green for people who are not obese. And once again, we find this effect that if I know what your friend's friend's friend obesity status is in the Framingham Heart Study, I can do better than chance of predicting what your obesity status is as well. And we have reason to believe that at least some of this is influence, that there are decisions that people are making that are traveling through the network and having an impact on what you do. And again, we've looked at this on Facebook, and we find clusters of overweight women and overweight men in these close tie networks. Not only is it the case that networks influence the spread of these well-being measures, they also are a source of well-being. And so we looked at loneliness with John Cacioppo, for example. And here what we did is we colored the people who described being lonely as blue and the people who described not being lonely as yellow. And you can see that the blue nodes, they're at the edge of the network. In other words, the network information is giving us objective information about your social life. And it conforms to people's self-report of whether or not they feel lonely. But one of the interesting things here is that people who feel lonely, they actually cut ties to other people in the future. And so it's almost like if we don't take care of the periphery of this network, that what will happen is it will be like a sweater coming unraveled at the edges. And in this case, what it really shows is that well-being is not just a function of what spreads through the network, it's a function of the network itself, of where you sit in the network and the structure of the ties of the people that are closely related to you. And we found that this is also true for depression. A measure of depression is closely related to clinical measures of depression, that the network can tell us whether or not you're likely to be depressed because you tend to be at the edge of these networks. And so networks not only spread well-being, they have an impact on well-being that we may not be able to do that much about as individuals if we're thinking of ourselves using this traditional Robinson Crusoe model of social science. So beyond well-being, there are things that spread in networks that are actually decisions that we make that have implications for ethical behavior. So for example, we've studied the spread of illegal drug use. There are some people that talk about the harms of this as it being an ethical dilemma. And here we find that if your friend's friend's friend does marijuana and you're in high school, that you are more likely to do marijuana yourself. And then at least some of this is causally related to the other person's behavior. In fact, it's causally related to the other people's non-drug use behavior. In this case, if your friend sleeps more, then you are more likely to sleep more, and as a consequence, you are less likely to do drugs. You get lots of things flowing through the network, some of which have ethical implications and some of which don't. And so this idea that we're making individual choices is really interesting, because what we can do is we can take you out of wherever you are in the network, disconnect you from a lot of people who are making these ethical choices and put you somewhere else, and you might actually end up making different kinds of choices. And then the real question is, well, what's the baseline? How can we characterize whether or not your behavior is actually ethical? We also have found experimentally that generosity can spread in networks. And so when we had people in the laboratory randomly assigned to play a public goods game with other people, what we found was that people who were randomly assigned to others who gave more whenever they were asked to make a choice between keeping money for themselves or giving to a group project, that they tended then to give more in the future themselves. So if Eleni gave more in the game with Lucas, then Lucas in the next round, when he was randomly assigned to a different set of people, would give more in the game with Erica, Erica would give more in the game with Jay, and Jay would give more in the game with Brecken. And you won't be surprised by this, we find that these effects spread up to 3 degrees of separation. And this is experimental evidence. We've had some debate about whether or not you can get causal effects from observational studies, but this is an experimental study where it's pretty clear that the results that we find, the most likely explanation is that there's a causal relationship between being exposed to someone's ethical behavior and your own ethical behavior. And so this complicates things quite a bit because at one point Amartya says in his book that when we think about capabilities, for example, I'm not going to talk about the individual capabilities with reference to the group. And there are a number of reasons that he says he's not going to do that, but one of them is it's too hard. It's just too difficult to try to think about what the reference point is if we're going to think about your behavior and your capabilities with respect to these other people that you're surrounded by. This shows, I think, that your decisions are dramatically influenced by the people that you're surrounded by. And so, yes, it's hard, but it might be necessary for us to be able to develop a complete theory of ethical behavior or a complete theory of justice. We also are inherently unequal. One of the things that Nicholas Christakis and I have been doing is we've been exploring the biological basis of various differences in network behavior. And one of the things that we have found in a comparison of identical twins to fraternal twins is that genes can explain a lot of the variation in where you sit in the network. And so, for example, the number of people who name you as a friend, that is about 50% heritable in this one study that we did that's a nationally representative study in the United States. And that kind of makes sense, right? Because personality, we kind of think of personality as being heritable. The number of friends you have is going to be a function of how extroverted you are. It's going to be a function of your physical attractiveness, things that it makes sense that would vary from person to person. But what we also find is that this influences how central you are to the network, right? Because the more friends you have, then the more friends of friends you're going to have, and the more likely you are going to be at the center of these networks. Again, that makes sense because it's related to the number of friends you have. But even more interestingly, we find that this measure of transitivity is heritable. So transitivity is the probability that 2 of your friends are friends with one another. Okay, so think about your own life for just a minute. Do you live in a group where everyone knows everybody else? Or are you at the intersection of a lot of groups where you connect those groups, but a lot of people in those groups don't know one another? And so that latter person, if you're more like that latter person, you're more like George Costanza in Seinfeld, where he was worried about having his girlfriend's friends meet his own friends, because then that would be the death of independent George. Worlds collide theory, that's right. So we find that this characteristic of transitivity is heritable. So now think about that for just a minute. What this means is that your inherent network structure, your inherent differences in network structure come from other people. Your genes have an influence on whether 2 other people are friends. And so to try to think about ourselves like the Robinson Crusoe model dictates, as individuals, as people that are not connected to other people is not just a matter of choice, it's also a matter of the very properties that we were inherently given at birth. Now, we've extended this work to look at specific genotypes. And one of the interesting things here is that we find that we share genotypes with our friends. Even controlling for ancestry, if I know what version of this particular dopamine gene you have, I can do better than chance at predicting what version your friend has. Even at the allelic level, we're looking at 500,000 of these, and we're able to find several that exhibit this property. And this is a result of us selecting into environments, into social environments, where the same kinds of people are drawn into those environments. And it's also a product of us selecting specific friends that have specific characteristics. Now, the reason why this is important for ethics is because what it suggests is that we are inherently at a disadvantage or at an advantage in terms of being exposed to these things that are spreading through the network. We are inherently at an advantage or at a disadvantage at being susceptible to the harms that come from, say, being at the edge of the network, to loneliness, to depression, to these other outcomes that affect our well-being. And so that complicates the picture as well. And then I'll talk about my third point here, which is that there are some ethical dilemmas that we wouldn't be aware of if we didn't think about the world this way. If we didn't really try to map these connections between individuals, we wouldn't know about lots of different trade-offs that we make all the time without being aware of them. And so one of these is the distinction between periphery and core. Okay, so just for example, it has been shown through simulations that we can get the same benefit in terms of vaccinating the population if we vaccinate the 1/3 of the population that is most central and leave the other 2/3 out of the vaccination program as we can get by vaccinating everybody. And so what this suggests is that these central nodes are critically important for the spread of contagious disease, for example. And that's modeling that applies to the flu, but it also applies to all these other things that appear to spread in networks normatively. But this presents a kind of dilemma. So are we going to just vaccinate the people who are most central? Are we going to just help those people at the center because we know that'll make the people at the periphery better off? Are we going to engage the question of whether that inequality that arises from those nodes is one that is going to make everybody better off, but is in turn going to increase the distance between the people at the center and at the periphery? It's an open question. Not only is it the case that people at the periphery may get less services as a consequence of this kind of reasoning, but they may also get paid less attention to. So this is a work that Nicholas and I did where we followed people at the center of the network and people at the periphery in order to be able to predict the outcome of a flu epidemic. And what we found was that if you follow people at the center, you actually get early warning that the flu is coming for everybody. In fact, you can get 2 weeks advance warning by looking at the people who are at the center of this network. And so that suggests not only is it the case that people at the center of the network might get more services, they might also get more attention paid to them. And again, it raises this question, are we just going to completely ignore the people at the periphery in order to be able to achieve these network benefits? If so, what are the implications for inequality? So that's one dilemma. Another dilemma is whether or not we should pay attention to victims or to people who are influential. And let me give you an example of this. So in our study on drinking behavior, you won't be surprised to find out that the gender that is most likely to drink heavily is men. But in our study, what we were able to show was that the people who were most influential in spreading their behavior were women. In fact, we didn't find any evidence that men's drinking behavior had any impact on the behavior of anybody else whatsoever. All of the spreading behavior that we found in this network was a result of women spreading their behavior and their attitudes that are implicitly underlying that behavior. And so the question is, if you're trying to help people, you're trying to make them better off, do you directly target the men who are susceptible to the problem, or do you target the women because the women are, in turn, tied to a lot of men? Counterintuitively, you might be better off targeting the women for some kind of intervention because you'll end up making more men better off. But then again, we have a dilemma. Are you going to target the people who are most in need, or are you going to target the people who will ultimately be able to help the people most in need? And what are the inequality implications as a consequence of this particular network view of the world? And so the last element that I'll just point out is that some of the ways that we've been trying to use networks to be able to achieve different kinds of outcomes for well-being lead us to this dilemma between having a health benefit or a social benefit. And so, for example, when we studied smoking behavior, once again, we find that this behavior spreads to 3 degrees of separation, and we find that social norms work, that social norm campaigns work, because starting in the 1980s, when these campaigns started coming on board, we saw big decreases in the incidence of smoking. But we also saw that smokers started getting pushed to the outside of their social networks. So at the same time that we were giving a benefit to all the people that we were able to help quit smoking, we were socially harming the smokers who couldn't quit smoking. And I have not seen anywhere in the literature where people have considered this social cost. We know that these people are pushed to the edge of the network. They're more susceptible to loneliness, they're more susceptible to depression, they're more susceptible to a wide variety of social harms. And so without having this network conceptualization, we wouldn't adequately be able to understand these trade-offs that are going on between getting people to change their behavior and the side effects of using these social norm campaigns to get people to change their behavior. So let me just conclude with another famous Indian's words. You must be the change you wish to see in your world. And this is exactly what I was thinking the whole time that I was reading this lovely book. That this is really what this is about. A theory of justice that's built on trying to use our capabilities to do the things that we can on the issues on which we can all agree. But what I really want to do is I want to propose a friendly amendment, and that is you must be the change you wish to see in your network. Networks are powerful, and we need to acknowledge that if we're going to have a complete theory of justice. And so thanks to my network and thanks to you guys.
All right, well, following the first couple of speakers, I feel a little bit like the lounge act following Bruce Springsteen. But I want to, of course, thank Fonna and Jerry very much for this invitation to the conference. It's both a pleasure and an honor to share the opportunity to celebrate the idea of justice with such an impressive roster of speakers. Professor Sen refers in his work to the importance of positional perspective, so in the interest of full disclosure, let me state that I'm a behavioral economist. In case you don't know behavioral economics, one definition is that it is an approach to economics informed by psychology. Another one is it's the study of the possibility that at least some agents in the economy are real people. So within this area, I study ethical preferences, including altruism, reciprocity, but my research is focused particularly on justice. Until fairly recently, most of my fellow economists looked upon justice as one might a Yeti or the Loch Ness Monster, something big, ugly, and probably fictional. But this skepticism has little by little been shaken, partly by the work, of course, of Professor Sen and others like him, and partly by empirical findings in the behavioral economic research that has produced evidence of the relevance of moral motivation in actual economic decision-making. This research evolved initially mostly as a positive research program, but attempts have begun slowly to build bridges to prescriptive research in normative economics and moral philosophy. Such connections are very much in line with the thinking of Adam Smith, who figures prominently in the idea of justice. And I see many possible points of connection with behavioral economics in issues that Professor Sen raises, including on happiness, institutions, collective choice, and procedural justice. But I wish to, and I've been ignoring my slides. Actually, I don't even need these. You know what? Let's just forget it. So I've been focusing on two areas. I want to focus on two areas in this talk. Areas that have received attention in the idea of justice as well as significant attention in behavioral economics. The topics are distributive justice and impartial spectators. My general point is going to be that Sen's claims about justice and impartiality are broadly consistent with findings from the behavioral economic research about the values that people actually hold, at least the impartial values that have a putative claim to some normative relevance. One caveat, I'm going to appear to agree a lot with Amartya Sen, but I think I might be agreeing in many instances with my projection of Sen onto himself. So Sen discusses justice in the broadest possible sense, but certainly one important type of justice is distributive justice, which concerns the fair distribution of economic and social benefits and burdens. Sen argues repeatedly, and I think convincingly, that justice is a plural or multi-criterion concept. He illustrates this already in the introduction with a parable, and several times subsequently, that involves distributive justice. This is an illustration of three children, Anne, Bob, and Carly, each of whom can appeal to a different reason for receiving a flute. The three reasons are very close, in fact, to the three principles of distributive justice that I believe emerge from a comprehensive analysis of the empirical evidence on actual impartial fairness views. Anne's claim on the flute is that she's the only one actually able to play it. That is, she's the only one trained to produce music with it. This is broadly resonant with the efficiency principle of distributive justice, which states that all else equal, resources ought to be allocated so as to maximize surplus or the aggregate good. Bob's claim on the flute is that he is the poorest, and in contrast to the other two, otherwise has no toys. This is reminiscent of the need principle, which states that all else equal, the basic needs of individuals should be satisfied and that resources should go first to those whose basic needs have not yet been met. Carla appeals to the fact that she has already worked hard in recent months to produce the flute and that she deserves it as the fruit of her labor. This exemplifies the accountability principle, which states that fair allocations should be in proportion to the contributions that individuals control. That is, the accountability principle involves proportionality. If Carla is twice as productive as Bob, for instance, then she should receive twice as much of the output. But it is also a desert-based rule. Carla should receive twice as much if her additional productivity is due to her effort or other variables that she controls. But if Carla and Bob exert the same amount of effort, and those differences are purely due to things that they do not control, for instance, Bob is born with a congenital physical handicap, then that accounts for that difference in productivity, then they should receive equal shares. So in this case, Carla presumably chose to work harder and Anne and Bob not, so Carla deserves the total output according to the accountability principle. There is considerable empirical evidence that people value each of these principles, all other things equal. But of course, the pursuit of one goal often conflicts with the satisfaction of another. For instance, allocating according to efficiency or accountability does not necessarily guarantee that the basic needs of all individuals would be satisfied if some individuals, by virtue of just those other principles, would not meet their basic needs. In the case of the three children, the conflict is particularly stark, given the indivisibility of the flute. Only one child can receive it, only one principle can be satisfied. What to do? Sen's parable also illustrates how this question is typically resolved. If there is a fourth element of distributive justice, in addition to the three principles, that is necessary for justice evaluation, namely context. By context, I mean the information that is provided about the people who are potential claimants on some benefit or burden, and about the variables that are relevant to moral judgments about those claims. As Sen points out, if we're only informed about the arguments of one child and nothing else, we tend to favor that child's claim over the others. Context affects how individuals, even those reasoning impartially, interpret and weight the competing principles. Context consists more, however, than just framing effects. Framing effects occur when inconsequential changes in the presentation of equivalent information has some effect on judgments. To be sure, framing effects do occur in fairness judgments, but fairness responds to contextual information precisely because of what that information conveys about the underlying individuals and variables that are relevant to the principles that people care about. Under conditions of perfect information, fairness judgments would vary with variations in the real importance of the potentially competing criteria. Thus, in the context of the effects of context are not necessarily labeled, but rather frequently obey certain rules and behave in patterned and predictable ways. Context, in this sense, also suggests an approach for addressing issues of global justice. Most traditions in philosophical ethics are universalists, often resting on a single, quasi-context-free principle. Another position is that justice is context-specific, view that's been defended by Elster, Walser, Young, and others. The extreme version of this is moral relativism, that considers moral norms as differing substantively from context to context. And advocates of this position often point to differences in moral norms across different cultures. By this view, there are no universal principles. The idea of justice presents compelling arguments that reasons are not singular, but rather plural, and that pursuing a universal or universalist or transcendental approach is not typically the most fruitful approach to solving practical justice problems. One might interpret these claims as implying an anti-theoretical and context-specific version of justice. I read Sen, though, as suggesting a third way that is neither universalist in the traditional sense, nor one that condemns us to the nihilism of moral relativism. Sen also argues that people are capable of broad consensus about matters of justice. And I believe this claim garners support from recent evidence from the empirical findings about actual values that I interpret as implying that justice is not context-specific, but it is context-dependent. What I mean by context-dependent is the following. Most individuals share a common set of principles, but the principles depend on the context. The context includes the information and the experiences of individuals both within and across cultures. So the observed differences in moral judgments between individuals and across cultures do not necessarily reflect fundamental differences in the principles that they value. Further, and this is an even stronger assertion, the effects of context on judgments had my notes mixed up. Okay. Are not, these effects are not arbitrary or capricious, but actually obey to some degree certain rules. So an illustration might help. Briefly from experimental economics, a very common workhorse of experimental economics, a certain type of bargaining experiment. And it's revealed systematic deviations from the predictions of the model of rational self-interest across hundreds of replications across the globe. And yet this experiment prompts potentially a wide variety of motivations, including self-interest, accountability, need, efficiency, reciprocity, and trust. And there have been significant differences across different variations in the design and the subject pools. Nevertheless, I read the pattern of these differences as being supportive of context-dependent justice. The subjects act in accordance with accountability in experiments, for instance, where the earnings are earned rather than simply endowed like manna from heaven. We also see in societies that are heavily based on reciprocal motives that individuals seem to respond more to reciprocity in the context of the experiment. So in other words, the results vary in relation to how the information and the parameters of the experiment, as well as the cultural information and expectations that subjects bring into the laboratory, affect their interpretation and application of a common set of principles. Let me now turn quickly to the second theme of this talk, which is Smithian impartial spectatorship and its relationship to the empirical version of spectatorship in behavioral economic research. So in the idea of justice, Sen, so since I'm running out of time, I have to talk a lot faster, so you have to listen quicker. Sen contrasts the Rawlsian thought experiment with the Smithian impartial spectator. In the theory of moral sentiment, Smith describes impartiality in terms of the views of real, not idealized people who are not purely self-interested, as with Rawls, but rather endowed with a moral sense. Moreover, they're not denied any information, as in Rawls, but rather they're well-informed about the relevant particulars, and they achieve impartiality instead by distancing themselves from their stations. Well, there's a growing empirical research agenda in behavioral economics that makes use of spectators of a sort. This work originally emerged without any explicit connection to Smith, and there are important differences for the Smith scholars among us. There are, I acknowledge, important differences with the notion of impartial spectator that Smith promotes, but there are, I think, also remarkable similarities. I call this the quasi-spectator method, and the clearest example involves third-party subjects or spectators who are provided with information about other subjects called stakeholders. The spectators are paid fixed fees to make decisions that affect the earnings of the stakeholders. For instance, in the first such economics experiments, I had stakeholders perform a task that produced earnings, after which the spectators allocated that among the stakeholders. And the results strongly corroborated the accountability principle, with spectators allocating earnings in proportion to the contributions that stakeholders controlled, but equalizing for other differences that they did not control. And I've also, with some collaborators doing work in the US and Japan, found a similar pattern of these same values, but also subtle context-dependent differences in the interpretation and application of those. This quasi-spectator method seeks to access the moral sense presumed by Smith to be embedded in real people. Specifically, the moral judgments are elicited are those of a quasi-spectator, since the moral sense is observed with error. Moreover, there's no presumption of unanimity in the views that are expressed, not only because of measurement error, but also because impartial spectators differ themselves in how they interpret and apply principles in given contexts. Nevertheless, we often observe a kind of consensus or convergence of views across subjects. In fact, a stylized result of quasi-spectator studies is that the views of spectators converge significantly more in statistical terms than those of stakeholders. And this method has been applied to study not only distributive justice, but also a number of other moral preferences, such as altruism, rewards from risk-taking, and reciprocity. To clarify this method, let me elaborate what the quasi-spectator is not. It does not embrace the view that the moral judgments in isolated contexts are necessarily going to provide meaningful representations of informed, impartial views, let alone ones on which policy should be based. In other words, it does not put up morality for a vote. It doesn't say, yes, we should go to war in Iraq if a majority of people vote for it or think that that's the right thing to do. The approach also does not propose that we ask people or what moral theory or theories they favor. The claim is that people share a common moral sense, but not necessarily that they are able to articulate that sense in general terms. Rather, it requires the involvement of the researcher in designing and interpreting, using reasoning, the results of such studies. So let me conclude by just saying that I think the idea of justice represents an important contribution to moral philosophy and the social sciences. It's remarkable for its breadth, depth, and originality. But I think its insights are also very consistent with a lot of findings from behavioral economic research, and I think it will also inspire a lot of future research in that area. Thank you.
I want to, like everyone else, I want to thank Fonna and Jerry for organizing this wonderful conference and all the other people who helped organize as well. It's been very interesting for me, and I appreciate your interest and your patience as well. So I'm going to try to be extremely brief so that we can have more time for discussion. I'm a great fan of Amartya Sen's work. I mean, I have been for a long time. I think this new book is magnificent, and I accept his critique of transcendental institutional theories. I totally agree with his positions on incompleteness and pluralism and cosmopolitanism. I used a lot of his work in my dissertation many years ago and in my first book, and I've been indebted to him ever since the 70s. So I'm not going to try to criticize. Instead, what I'm going to do is try to make one point that I think will provide partial support for a view that I agree with, and that's the capability approach. I do happen to agree with a version of that capability approach that Dick Arneson mentioned in the very first paper of this conference, namely one that uses an objective list theory to talk about which types of capabilities really matter and how much they matter. And I know Amartya doesn't buy all of that, but I wanted to put that on the table, that there might be a little bit of disagreement there. But to defend the capability approach in general against alternatives, I take it that Amartya and I need to show that, first of all, that capabilities are valuable, but more importantly, that they're valuable independently of the other factors that other people have used as informational foci for their theories of justice. That is, independently of primary goods and welfare and resources and achievement and Republican freedom. And I think showing that it has this kind of independence is part of what undermines the view of people as homo economicus, because what it means is that we're not always out to get goods, particular objects. We're not always out to get pleasure. We're not always out to satisfy preferences. That other things matter, including capabilities. So that's the overall theme. To support that view, I want to use a somewhat indirect method, namely by comparing health. In the book, Amartya mentions many times physical health, and that makes perfect sense in the context of development. But just because of my own interests, I want to emphasize mental health. And mental health can be interesting to global justice in a number of different ways. First of all, it's rampant and it's debilitating and devastating, as Janice Jenkins reminded us in her paper. It also, I think, provides an illuminating comparison to the effects of deprivation. But what I want to focus on is that you can use mental health and our intuitions, our views about mental health, as a guide to what is or is not good or bad and what makes it good or bad. So you can do that in a number of different ways. First of all, mental health shows us that you can't judge value solely on the basis of desires, because one of the striking features of many mental illnesses is that people with these illnesses end up desiring things that are clearly bad for them. And so it affects the theory of value and thus, again, undermines the classic view of people as homo economicus. But I want to do something a little bit different. I think you can use mental illness to show that capabilities are valuable independently of all those other factors that have been used in other theories of justice. My arguments actually resemble Alexander Kaufman's discussion of some of Williams's examples, but I'm going to focus on mental illnesses here. So let's start with, and I'll just give two examples for the sake of time. Let's start with a cognitive mental illness first, namely a delusion, Capgras syndrome. Sometimes pronounced Capgras syndrome, but I call it Capgras. So this is the delusion that people have when they think that many of their friends and family have been replaced by imposters. And it's actually not that uncommon, surprisingly common. There could be a giant conspiracy going on. I don't know. And it's interesting because what makes it a delusion is that it doesn't respond to reasons, right? I mean, the wife will say, "Oh no, it's still me. Remember all this." But of course, that just shows what a good imposter she is. So it's difficult to undermine that. Now, just imagine the patient is wealthy. They have all the resources in the world, that they need for the things that they get and that they want to get. And they're not even unhappy. They think, well, actually, this imposter's a pretty good cook, and sex, she's good at that too. And so they might not be unhappy, and they might be wealthy. They could have all the primary goods and the civil rights and so on. But it's still a delusion, and it's still a mental illness. And that suggests that we have this view that there's something bad about it. Of course, one thing that's bad about it is the belief is false. But that's not what makes it a mental illness. What makes it a mental illness, I mean, people make mistakes and hold false beliefs all the time. What makes it a mental illness is the lack of capability, right? For mental illness, they need the incapability to respond to evidence. That's what makes it a delusion according to the standard classifications. So it looks like the incapacity is bad independent of the resources and welfare and so on. And that's recognized in the way we classify these illnesses. I should mention also, just as an aside, that it's also confirmed by neuroscience. The studies that people have done to try to understand mental illnesses on the neural level have suggested that certain incapacities in working memory and in executive inhibition and control are behind the occurrence of these delusions. So that's a cognitive mental illness. Just one more example would be a non-cognitive mental illness, like a compulsion. And there are lots of compulsions out there. I'll just pick the example of someone who's really a workaholic. They keep working all the time, and they can't stop. Well, actually, I've got some colleagues who work 16, 18 hours a day, and they love it, right? Now, they might be wealthy. They might actually achieve a lot. They might have plenty of resources and money, as well as civil rights and so on. But there's a difference between somebody who works 16, how many hours a day do you work, Amartya? It must be 22. And so you can achieve a lot, and so you're not lacking in the other things, but if you lack the control over yourself and the capability of stopping and deciding when you're going to do it or not, that's what turns it into a compulsion. That's what makes it a mental illness. And the idea behind classifying mental illnesses in that way, and the tendency to classify mental illnesses in that way, suggests that we really do think that the lack of capability in those cases is bad independently of the other factors, because the person is made worse off by that lack of capacity, even when they have all the other goods that are focused on by other theories of justice. So I do want to be very quick, so I'll just mention a couple of responses here that people might make. One is that well, look, Rawls listed health as a primary good in a theory of justice, so what's the news here? And the answer is, well, sure, some of the things that Rawls lists as primary goods are in fact capacities. There's overlap between these two sets. But when he gets to the social primary goods, he lists things like income, wealth, the basis of self-respect. And if you think of the workaholic, just to pick that example, they might have income, wealth, and the basis of self-respect. They've got all that stuff, but you have to add capabilities as something that's bad independently of those other items that happen to be on the list. You can also say that, another critic might say that, in fact, the problem with incapabilities is that they bring risks. That when things change, you're not going to respond to those changes, and that's what's behind the inclination to think that it's bad. But actually, for workaholics, it might be that there's very little risk that their tendency is going to change. They can keep going for a long time. I know people that are still working extremely hard late into life, and it's not like there was a risk that this incapacity to stop is going to affect their life. Or at least intuitively, it doesn't seem to me that that's what's behind what's bad about it. And finally, I want to say that, and many critics will say, you know, but surely incapabilities, lack of capability is not the only thing. Well, of course, if you take two people who equally lack the capability and one's really unhappy about it and one's happy about it, then that's, you know, that shows that other things can be valuable too. But I take it that Amartya and I would agree, you know, we're pluralists, so sure, happiness and resources might count too in some ways, but capabilities have this independent value that make it plausible to make your informational focus in a theory of justice on those capabilities. So you can't draw, of course, any particular social conclusions from the little bit that I've done here. I'm talking more about a foundational issue in the theory, that in order to make the theory work, you need to have some kind of independent value for these capabilities and independent disvalue for the incapabilities. And I wouldn't think that that shows that you ought to have one particular policy as opposed to another particular policy. It doesn't have the direct applications. But it is, I think, a necessary part of defending the theory to show that incapability is bad independently of these other informational foci, and that's what I've tried to support here. Thanks.
Morning. Thank you, Fonna. Thank you, Jerry, and all of you. May I speak in French? So I will do it in the best of my French. Considering the topic of this session, I thought that it would be relevant to discuss a category of happiness that is addressed in several of Amartya Sen books, and explicitly so in one chapter of the idea of justice. Those texts clearly articulate some of Sen's central concepts with respect to the critique of the utilitarian position and the relevance of the concept of capabilities. From that starting point, I would like to briefly point out the need to reformulate the foundation of a general anthropology that moves beyond the restricted worldview of Homo economicus and to consider, or better said, evoke, problems such as connection between rationality and emotions, and capabilities and social recognition. By doing so, I will also ask questions to some of the speakers of today's session. I would like to start with a personal anecdote, which took place a long time ago in France. As an undergraduate student in philosophy, one of the first papers I had to write had the following prompt: is there a right to happiness? We were told that in the Declaration of Independence of the Founding Fathers of the United States of America, the Declaration has included among the inalienable right of every human being, along with the right to life and liberty, the pursuit of happiness. How could that claim be supported? To this day, I still clearly remember how confused I felt. I had been taught a few things about happiness by my teacher. For the Stoics, for example, the secret of happiness was to change one's desires rather than to attempt to change the order of things. For the Epicureans, one had to fight suffering through indifference, ataraxia. For Aristotle, the good life, eudaimonia, was the main source of our motivation. For Kant, the pursuit of happiness could in no way constitute a moral goal. But none of those authors, I thought, was of any help with the question, is there a right to happiness? Aristotle might have provided me with valuable assistance if our professor had not invested all of his effort on refuting Bentham with Kant's critique of practical reason. Anyhow, I remain obsessed with that question, and it appeared to me in a very different light once I had left that purely philosophical bubble and spent 2 years studying social anthropology with field work in West Africa, in the Ivory Coast, to be precise. I then discovered different ways to live everyday life, to enter in relationships, to conceive of comfort, the expression of joys, the sharing of food, the role of kinship, rituals, storytelling, and many other things. I realized that the question of happiness had to be stated in different terms, completely different terms. The way I had learned to consider it in university now appear overly abstract, expressed in essentialist terms, and therefore precluding any interesting debate. For me, the relevant questions were now the following. What type of happiness are we talking about? Should happiness be understood in terms of well-being? If so, under what condition? And according to what criteria with respect to sharing with others? An entire set of problems appear involved, since the question could neither be reduced to a subjective approach nor left to cultural relativism. Did this mean that the question had to be considered in purely sociological and economic terms and reducible to the question of welfare? According to what criteria? It seemed obvious that a problem of justice was involved, in terms not only of the distribution of resources, but also of access to various kinds of goods, like education, healthcare, labor market, that I had until then in Europe regarded as the normal or basic privileges of all human beings. In Abidjan, where I lived for 2 years, I taught philosophy in the 12th grade, since philosophy, as you maybe know, is still taught in high school in France and in Francophone Africa. I wondered, what do these students think of happiness? Maybe they knew what it was better than I did. I thus gave them the same prompt. Is there a right to happiness? Their answers surprised me a lot, bringing to mind the question raised by Professor Konow in his presentation about tests conducted in various and cultural contexts. I would like to know more about the Japanese answer you have mentioned. The answer from these African students were significantly different from the answer Europeans would have given. Two main points stood in their papers. First, happiness is the physical well-being for each individual and is a wonderful thing provided that no member of my group is excluded. Second, it is important to ensure that through those goods, each person is honored according to what he or she deserves, so that no envy or humiliation can arise. And that was strongly emphasized. I was thus dealing with a view that spontaneously integrated the idea of reciprocity, solidarity, and dignity. In other words, of the idea of justice. In effect, those students had a stronger sense of social fairness than I did, and were true Aristotelian. I'm sure that Francesca Moneti would agree with me. Unfortunately, due to the separate school system for boys and girls, there were no female students in my class, and I was deprived of the answer they might have given. I understood that I had to re-examine the problem in terms of well-being, the reasonable constituent of that well-being, and the relationship between individuals and collective welfare. Those questions were at the same time economic and ethical in nature. Better yet, they were questions of economic ethic, and they therefore involved distributive justice. But was that enough? I had no clear answer. I did not have the concept that would have enabled me to grasp at the same time resources, action, and freedom. This is precisely the point when Amartya Sen's capability approach appeared to me remarkable and able of providing the answer I needed. I must mention that I found out about Sen's approach through the philosopher Paul Ricoeur, who in France was among the first to recognize and discuss Sen's work, and whose final philosophy, Ricoeur, focuses on what he calls capable person, mentioned yesterday by Anthony Lyon. Ricoeur discusses this in his last book, Course of Recognition. One section of it is devoted to Amartya Sen theory. So I could now say that happiness can be considered as a right if understood as a matter of justice in terms of institution and capabilities. But it is also an emotional experience, not separable from moral norms, what Adam Smith will call moral sentiments. And that leads me to the conclusion with two sets of questions. First, I believe that it is desirable and even essential that in the wake of I'm done. In the wake of Amartya Sen's work, philosophers reformulate what is called a fundamental or general anthropology, that is a theory of the human being, by discussing, based on new foundation, the connection between rationality and emotions. In a seminal work that we all know, Albert Hirschman showed how, through the development of political economy, the old theory of dynamic of passions came to be replaced by the logic of interest, which had the advantage of making prediction possible based on a simple hypothesis, the selfishness of the agent. What is to say, a single passion. The entire theory of rational choice was constructed and developed based on this anthropology of Homo economicus, an over rudimentary anthropology at best. Today, neuroscience, see them as you, and many others, among them our colleague Darren Schreiber, tell us that a complex emotional activity that includes a lack of self-interest is a condition of the most rational behavior. This changes the stakes of all the recent development in what is called moral psychology, and therefore the entire conception of agency as associated with the concept of capability. And second and last point, this point involves what is called social recognition. To my knowledge, that term is not found in Sen's writing. Yet it seems to me that although it does not use the term, the concept of social recognition is in effect at the core of the theory of capabilities, or at least it can be so. This approach is entirely compatible with the idea that for a laborer, whether artisan, teacher, technician, or manager, the satisfaction provided by the proper performance of a task and the public recognition generated by that performance are no less important than the income it provides. As another example, Sen notes that in terms of income, to be poor in a rich country is not the same thing as to be poor in a poor country. I would like to add that neither it is the same thing in terms of social recognition. To be poor in a rich country, paradoxically, can be a worse humiliation than in two ways, in terms of lack of recognition by others, and in terms of lack of self-esteem. The problem can be generally stated in this way. Even with the same income, the lack of public esteem associated with physical handicaps, gender or race differences, or the status of immigrant can make life sometimes unbearable. but I'm wondering whether this could apply to mental handicaps. That is a question for Professor Sinnott-Armstrong. Finally, I would like to ask Professor Sen whether we could consider the possibility of an economics of social recognition, for example, by defining an esteem perception index as an element of a theory of human development. I admit it would be more reasonable to seek how the capability approach could at least contribute to this goal, and that such a measurement is beyond our reach. Thank you.
I'm going to synthesize my reflections on the 4 presentations in terms of a view of 6 capabilities that I'm going to view from the lens of a field I'm going to call neuropolitics. I'm going to describe these 6 capabilities, the first being our capability for making choices. Secondly, our capability of connecting our values to the policy choices that we face in the world. Third, our capability of feeling our own feelings and the feelings of others. Fourth, a capability for humanizing others. Fifth, our capability for achieving consensus. And sixth, our capability for changing our brains through practice. Given A, that individuals are observed to have distinct sets of preferences that appear to be at least 40% genetically heritable. B, that there appears to be very little support for the idea of innate abilities, i.e. there's no child, or e.g. there's no child prodigies. And C, that practice consistently appears to be strongly related to ability. The emphasis on capabilities in Sen's work is crucial and justified. Uniform distributions of resources would not match our non-uniform distributions of preferences. So an emphasis on simple distributive justice would be rather pointless exercise. Rather, we might properly consider that enabling individuals to increase their capabilities will increase the likelihood that individuals will obtain what they desire most. First, let's consider the capability of responsibility, our ability to choose in the gap between stimulus and response. Experimenters gave a 3-year-old child a marshmallow and told that child that if they could wait until the experimenter returned, they would receive a second marshmallow. Decades later, when they looked at the response times of these children, it turned out that the children that could not wait for that second marshmallow suffered incredible lifelong consequences in a broad range of outcomes, from their health, socioeconomic status, education, incarceration. The amount of time that it took that a child could take to wait for that second marshmallow predicted tremendously difficult outcomes if they were not able to hold off a little bit. Walter Sinnott-Armstrong emphasizes mental illness in his discussion of capability. Through the lens of Patricia Churchland's theory, each of these instances that Walter discusses can be seen as diminishing our brain's zone of control. When we wake up groggily this morning, as I did, our ability to control the impulse to turn off the alarm clock is impaired. I actually turned it off, I think, about 5 times this morning. My zone of control was diminished in my groggy state. If we're addicted, we're impaired in our ability to avoid that drink or that cigarette or that trip to Las Vegas, again, diminishing that zone of control in our brain. If we're obsessive compulsive, we're impaired in our ability to be able to choose not to wash our hands one more time. Again, a diminishment of that zone of control. Conversely, we could consider flourishing, which I would describe as a set of conditions under which we're able to meaningfully contemplate a range of choices, creatively generate new choices, act according to conscience, and experience a level of self-awareness about the choices that we make. When we flourish as individuals, our brain's zone of control expands. The gap between stimulus and response has increased, and inverting Walter's line of thinking, we have greater capability. As our brains develop through childhood and adolescence, executive control in the brain increases, and we become more able to hold out for that second marshmallow. But there are many other ways that we can flourish as individuals and increasing our capabilities and increase our capability for making meaningful choices. Because of the complex nature of politics, it's extremely difficult to map our values that we have to the policy choices that we face. In the work of UNICEF through Mackie and Moneti that they've been doing with female genital cutting, they're providing an alternative mapping from the existing values in a village to a new set of policy choices. Expanding the repertoire of value to policy mappings that we possess increases the gap between the conditions in which we live, this set of stimuli, and the policies that we choose, the responses. Individuals who are knowledgeable about politics are far more able to map their values successfully to the political choices they face. My own research shows that this enhanced ability to map values to policy correlates with a shift from a set of brain regions involved in what I would describe as technical cognition to a set of brain regions involved in social cognition. Thus, the information that we require in order to successfully map our values to policy, onto the policy domain is not fundamentally technical, for instance, the type of civic education that we provide in high schools, but is rather social, the result of the kind of work that Mackey and Moneti are doing with UNICEF. In this light, Sen's emphasis on public reasoning is affirmed. As my frontal lobes develop, I'm more able to choose one in this first set of capabilities. I'm more able to choose this first set of capabilities among the value to policy mappings that I've acquired through social processes, this second set of capabilities I've described. In Fowler's work, we see the huge impact of our social network and how it plays on a range of phenomena such as obesity, divorce, loneliness, happiness, cooperation, depression, smoking, and sleep patterns. The neural mechanisms that appear to be to enable this influence that we have on each other include things such as mirror neurons, the insula, and the medial prefrontal cortex. Of considerable fascination to me is that these mechanisms enable us to have the type of fellow feeling that Adam Smith described. When I observe you engaging in a behavior or cognitive practice or an affective experience, a subset of the same neurons in my brain that I would be using and engaging in these same behaviors, cognitions, and emotions fire. These neurons, these mirroring neurons, these are known as mirroring neurons. And in my own research, I've shown that people who are very engaged in politics have stronger mirroring activations when they encounter political leaders. The insula region of the brain, which is located kind of about an inch in from here, is involved in interoception, my feelings of my own physiological states, my internal perception. Intriguingly, the work that James and I have done together shows that the insula region, this insula region in the brain, is involved specifically in egalitarian behaviors. My sensitivity to your internal state of well-being increases the likelihood that I will take from the rich and give to the poor. My capability of feeling my own feelings is related to my capability of feeling your feelings, and similarly in valuing egalitarian acts. I'm going to describe this as a third capability. The medial prefrontal cortex, another region of the brain that's just an inch in through my forehead, is another crucial mechanism, a neural mechanism for social cognition. With the medial prefrontal cortex, I'm able to invoke the intentional stance in the terms of Daniel Dennett. I can use my medial prefrontal cortex to think about your mental states. I can engage in what is sometimes called mentalizing or theory of mind. When we encounter social in-groups, we activate this medial prefrontal cortex. We use a neural mechanism that has self-reflective capabilities to think about the mental states of others within the in-group. And we tend to use a deontological ethic when we're engaging with these other in-group members and making moral choices about them. When we encounter social out-groups or when we encounter physical objects like my bottle of water, the medial prefrontal area is not activated. Thus, we appear to have evidence supporting these claims of dehumanization and objectification. This objectification occurs as we encounter homeless people or people of other races. When this area is injured or deactivated, we tend to engage in utilitarian moral judgments as opposed to the deontological judgments that we make when it's active. My own work has shown, however, that these outgroup effects can be very quickly overridden. When whites get signals that blacks are an us rather than a them, the medial prefrontal cortex engages. I expect that the Dalai Lama's notion of universal compassion is at least in part utilizing these mechanisms so that we can bring all of humanity into the category of us. This capability of humanizing others I'm going to describe as capability 4 on my list. James Konow's discussion of Sen supports this role for consensus. This possibility is made more likely as each of the previous capabilities that I've described are enhanced. when we are more capable of making meaningful choices, of connecting our values to policies, feeling the feelings of ourselves and others, and humanizing others, then we have a greater potential for achieving consensus, this capability 5 that I'm describing. We may even reach consensus despite very different means. In my own work, I've shown that if I brain image you while you're gambling, I can predict with 80% accuracy if you're a Republican or a Democrat, simply by observing the neural mechanisms that you're engaging while you're doing this gambling task. What's intriguing to me about this is that the behavior itself is non-informative. The Republicans and Democrats gamble exactly in the same way. They have identical behaviors. They achieve a type of consensus about what the right choices to make given these odds, despite the fact that they have very different neural reasons for doing so. So to return to the critical role of practice, we're told that 10,000 hours of deliberate practice can turn us into world-class experts, regardless of our, what we think of innate abilities. If I brain image you today and I teach you to juggle, and then have you juggle daily for 3 months and brain image you again, I'm going to see changes in the thickness of your gray matter in response to that practice, and changes in the white matter as your brain rewires as a result of that practice. Practice changes your brain. This is capability 6. Practice can enable us to overcome our automatic tendency to fear others. It can enable us to engage in politics as social phenomena. With practice, we increase our brain's zone of control and even flourish. Practice, practical reasoning, feeling empathy, each of these changes our minds. From the view of neuropolitics, considerations of capabilities and their meanings are dramatically enhanced when we understand the neural architecture that enables these capabilities. The central take-home point from my comments is that this neural architecture was designed to be flexible. In other words, our capabilities can grow. We can, 1, become more capable of making choices and have more freedom from merely impulsive or reactive behaviors. We can, 2, become more capable of connecting our values to the policy alternatives that we are facing. We can, 3, become more capable of feeling our own feelings and experiencing the fellow feeling with others. We can, 4, become more capable of humanizing others and turning thems into us's. 5, we can become more capable of consensus as we cultivate the previous 4 capabilities. And 6, we can become more capable of changing our brains as we routinely engage in this range of valuable practices. Thank you.
Excellent. Very good. Thank you. Amartya, would you like to engage, or should we go? Yes?
All right. Thank you. Well, again, very exciting session. I won't comment on the commentators because they are already commenting, other than noting that I was delighted that Marcel brought up the recall connection, because he was very, I admired him greatly. I was very happy when he and I got a degree together at the University of Padua, and except that he raised I thought, a slightly unfair charge against the president of Padua, that for not standing up for Galileo with sufficient vigor. It seemed a little unfair to the president, though perhaps not to Padua. On one small point, the social recognition thing, I do have something in the book, and I also have a book called Employment Technology and Development, where I distinguish between the recognition aspect and the income aspect of employment, how that being unemployed makes one of the dramatic differences is the way your recognition in the society goes down. And so that's a very important point. We do agree on that. And I agree with Darren's 6 capabilities that he emphasized. And I will study neuroarchitecture in the future, though I haven't done that in the past. But first of all, Francesca Moneti was wonderfully interesting as I, where is she? There she is. Learned a lot from it. I think there's one question that it did raise in my mind is this, that, and this has come up in the context of Islam now, but it's come up in other contexts. Also, it came up very much in the 19th century in the context of using a kind of classical form of Hinduism, in which people like Ram Mohan Rai and others did, going back to the Vedas and so on, they always, of course, involve some selection. Because, you know, the being whole may be a part, in this case of Islam, part of the Islamic thought, but then there are other aspects of it which those who would take a more reactionary view would cite. So I think in some ways what it requires is the question that has come up in the discussion and including in Abdulaziz's discussion, that I think it's a question of marrying reasoning with tradition, of which part of the tradition, of course, is religion. And again, I don't want to bore people going on and on about Akbar, but that is one of the most striking things he says when he talks about what he calls Wahi Akal, namely the path of reason. The fact that you value a religion does not exempt you from applying reasoning in seeing what of it, what do you make of it. So I think that's a very important point, and it's a striking thought that it came back to me when I was looking at that, other than just admiring what's going on there, which seems really extraordinarily interesting and important. James Fowler's network connection, I agree. I think the theory of justice modified by networking would be something very worth considering. We might chat about that a bit more. I think I was struck also by the problem that you referred to, not only how networking affects one's happiness and ability to choose, but how it raises policy dilemmas about whether to intervene with the victims or with those who are most influential. That's actually a dilemma that's present in academic world all the time, even when it comes to admission. I remember once, many years ago, raising the question with Lord Adrian, who was then the master of Trinity College. So he was my predecessor's predecessor, but I had become a young academic then, and I think some son of a wealthy monarch, a sheikh, I think, had been admitted with grades which I thought was totally unworthy of his coming to the college. So now I went there and I tried to convince Adrian about that. He first, of course, made a silly, clever but silly statement by saying, "Oh, surely by now I must have found out that you think there's a violation of impartiality, but you must know that Trinity has always been strictly impartial between partiality and impartiality." But then he went to the real issue by saying that, but you know, this guy is going to influence a lot of people. And would you rather be in a better informed, more liberal atmosphere where he knows what the world is thinking, rather than staying where he is? And would you attach any importance? It's the same question that's coming up here, namely that he is not a victim in any sense. On the other hand, his impact on others might be. And this is very important, again, since I've been at the head of a college and having been various academic capacities in US, it is a serious issue. But it sort of goes against individual justice of looking at admissions into a kind of social issue in which the networking is one of the concerns, clearly. The James Konow thing, again, I was impressed with many things, including, of course, the way the behavioral economics role is brought out, because it's a new thing, it's an exciting thing. I see it as having achieved many things already, one of which is to kill the rational choice theory, to the satisfaction of sophisticated economists, but not yet, I fear, in law and economics and rational choice politics. That might take a bit of time. There's a bit of a lag there. I think another thing has been the variety of issues, and I think James mentioned about it, brings out the complexity of values that we are able to entertain, including the principle illustration he gave to the take on the example that I had given involving these three people arguing for flute. But I think not the least of them is one of the questions that you mentioned in passing, which is, I think, a very important one, which has a certain history in economics, that is treating people as reasoning persons. You know, why are they choosing that? That question. That's an issue that was raised by Wicksell, a great Swedish economist, many, many years ago, when he was defending neoclassical economics, actually, and saying that a lot of the criticism is right, but one of the important things to recognize that neoclassical economics, by making each chooser go through a reasoning which you're trying to follow, is creating an understanding of human beings as they work, as reasoning persons. And then he contrasted, in Sweden, he said, but it would apply to the rest of the world too, we have been so used by traditional way of thinking about it to think of workers as just responding to stimuluses and never reasoning, that this, no matter what the faults of neoclassical economics might be, that it regenerates an understanding of human beings that are involved in every worker. Now, the reason why it's interesting is that Gunnar Myrdal, commenting on it, made a complete mess of the point and accused Wicksell of confusing normative and positive things. That was one of the illustrations he gave. But it wasn't an illustration of that at all. Wicksell was making a very different point, namely that if you place yourself on as the reasoning head of the person deciding, as behavioral economics is doing, you have to recognize, I think you said the word you used, that treat them as real people. I think that is a really major contribution, because in some ways rational choice theory are automatons. They're, you know, all you have to do is to find out what the self-interest is, and then there's no further choice. And I think that's a gigantic difference, actually. The way the problem with behavioral economics would lie in interpreting what the behavior really represents, because that is communicated through answering questions. And it's a question of whether we understand what's going on. And this comes up, we don't have the time to do it, but even on such things as framing issues that has come up. I mean, it's always been treated by the Kahneman-Tversky analysis, for example, that if a doctor presents to you, to take his famous example, that there's a 5% chance of death in one case, and then you tend to choose in a different way than when the doctor says the 95% chance of being alive is concerned. Now, judged as a speech, judged as statements, they're of course exactly equivalent. But judged as speech acts, they are not. I could ask myself, why is this doctor telling me that there's 5% chance of death? What's going on in his mind? So not only the doctor trying to say what I want to do, I'm trying to also find out what the doctor has. And given, as we know from, I think I'm heretical in thinking that the best book that John Maynard Keynes ever wrote is not the general theory, which is a fairly straightforward, simple, common sense book, but the treatise on probability. And I think it's quite clear that once you recognize that how much subjectivity is involved in any kind of statement on probabilities, I think as speech acts they're not. I would take it very differently, a doctor who emphasizes that I might die on the operation table, than another who emphasizes that, 95, 99% is, there's no problem at all. So I think that is a problem that I think behavioral economics will have to come to terms with. I haven't seen enough to convince me that the interpretational issues have been adequately addressed. I don't mean, this is not a comment on your paper, but the entire tradition, because it's such an important tradition that's coming out today. On the, I think I could have said something about Adams's impartial spectator, but I won't. I like the quasi-spectator idea, but you have to tell me more about that. On Walter's very interesting paper again, I think, let me just say that he gave me an out which I don't want to take, namely that in the context of development, maybe it's all right to concentrate on physical health rather than mental health, but that's not the case, as we know even from the work that was presented yesterday. Mental health is a huge problem for the development countries, and to the extent that we haven't come to terms with it, and certainly you're right, development of freedom says nothing on that, I think that's a failure. There is a whole ground that has to be covered there. And I think it has become clear how extensive mental problems across the developing world is. And reasoning is easy, that while mental problems are mostly generated by circumstances of stress and so on in a way that could be related to conditions in developing countries. So that's a hugely important area to get into. And this is a subject where I think the capability approach does have a genuine problem, I think. Because the way the approach has been motivated is that what are the options? You have more options than you can choose more, etc. But the ability to intelligently choose is something. Now we could, as Darren did, put it down as a capability to choose, I think, or I think you mentioned one of the ones. But this is not like other kinds of capability. These are not the options that you choose from. It is the act of choosing that you're looking. And I think it is it's an aspect of, the capability has become such a triumphalist area of research now, and conquering new and new territory, and I'm not against them. There's a lot of very good things that's coming out in applying it here, applying it there, and so on. But I think there are some basic weaknesses of the approach which have to be addressed more. And this is, I think, a really big weakness, namely, how do we deal with the issue of choosing? I mean, there are different suggestions, including I have some that I have considered in a paper, but it's not a satisfactory solution at all. By the way, one very small passing remark, I think you're quite right when you said that there's no conflict with the Rawlsian thing with the primary good thing, because some of his primary goods are in fact capabilities. And I agree with that. And, like he sometimes uses social basis self-respect, sometimes he uses self-respect as if it's a primary good itself. So I think he varies, and I think it's to the glory of Rawls that he's not consistent on that. But because, he's like other people thinking, he thinks of a new thing and then he sticks to it. And therefore allows it to come in, even though it seemed to contradict a bit of earlier what it did. There isn't a kind of rigid search for consistency, as I won't name people I find in some of my friends in the theory of justice. I thought that that's also a reason. It's not it's for this, given the time, to just make a passing remark on that would be wrong. That's why I think also the contrast between what I'm trying to present, the capability approach and Rawls in terms of primary goods and capability, is not a really as big a difference as people tend to make it to be. I've never saw that as a problem talking with Rawls. I think the other issues, transcendentalism, and those things that I talked about there, and the sovereign society and global thing, whose voices count, all these are there. And there are capability, as the wonderful paper yesterday indicate, that have really many things to offer. But I don't think Rawls would have really very much resisted that. He did the primary good at a time when nothing had been done, and the world was dominated by utilitarianism. And actually, he wrote in a collection that I did with Bernard Williams, where I think called Social Primary Goods. And I think he said, okay, these are concerns. We have to take that into account somehow. And then he says to what extent primary goods could be done. And then he points out rightly, since there's a first principle which comes up before the second principle does, the liberty has some of the concerns that capability has. I didn't really think there was a big resistance from Rawls there, really. And I don't think, if that was all there was difference between Rawls and me, then I wouldn't have really gone to town on that, because I think that's not so thick. I must stop here, but just to make two light-hearted remarks, if I may, which were One was when I was listening to networking and Facebook. I ought to share a story that the Facebooks could be very informative and sometimes not so. When I was checking in, my wife and I, in Cersei, where we tend to go, rather like Ulysses, but with greater volition and more capability there than Ulysses had. When we were checking into the hotel clerk, whom we know, because we go there every year, said that, I've been following your Facebook. So I said, no, I don't have a Facebook. And he said, no, you do have a Facebook. And I'm very interested how your ideas have evolved, in particular, how much more right-wing in your thinking you have become. And I said, really? I think it must be confusing. And then he produced one. Absolutely. It had my picture. It had get some data, my date of birth and education. And then it answered questions in first person, saying, thank you very much for writing to me. I really agree. I recommended Ludwig von Mises and Milton Friedman against Galbraith and Keynes. And it's interesting how difficult it is to eliminate it. We wrote, there was no response at all, and then eventually my secretary managed to get a response saying that we can't handle these things. So then I could, and this is a tribute to public reasoning, which is my more general theme, that I did the only recourse I knew, namely I called Hindustan Times and said that would they be interested. Of course they were interested. So it's a front page story, and the next day all the paper, Times of India, the Hindu, the Indian Express, all had it. And then on the advice of one of the reporters in Hindustan Times, I put in saying that I'm thinking of suing this person. And then we got an immediate response, saying that he is not, is actually an admirer of mine. He said a very young admirer of Amartya Sen. And I didn't mean any harm at all. I just wanted his ideas to be better known. And I know that if he considered my argument, he would agree with the position that I was attributed to him. So I think that's, I think on that I'm going to stop. And I'm also, if I may make one other light-hearted remark, I'm absolutely very much in agreement with Walter when he said that in pushing for capability, we're not denying many other things. I mean, happiness remains very important. If you ask me to dinner tomorrow, and he said, could you come to dinner? And I said, if I were to say, I'd be happy to come. And you don't usually come out back saying, I'm not asking you whether you're happy to come. I'm asking you whether you will come. I think because we regard happiness as a pretty good reason for doing it, and will remain so no matter how important capability is. Thank you.
Okay, great. Why don't we call it there?
I'm sorry about that.
That's no. We're very happy that you're engaging. So we will meet back again in, let's say, 15 minutes. No, should we take it longer? Should we take it to 20? Yeah, 20. Let's say 20 minutes. There are 3 papers in the next session. That's right. So a bit short. Right. Okay. So we'll meet back at 11:20. Okay.